going on, everyone? I'm Rhett Shull, and today we're going to be talking about Powercab. That went a lot smoother in my head when I thought about doing this. I started using it a few years ago, around the same time I started using the Helix live, and I think it solves a pretty big problem that a lot of guitar players have with modelers, especially in a live setting, which is that unless you're using some kind of cabinet, you don't have any stage volume whatsoever. So I've had a lot of success using the Helix live, especially on things like festival gigs or when you're playing opening slots. A gig where you don't have a ton of time to get on stage, get sound checked, place mics on a cabinet and do all the stuff that you would do with a normal amp. For me, the Helix works really well in that situation, but there's a few things with running just the Helix by itself that I don't typically enjoy. First of all, it's the monitoring. If you're on a wedge, for example, and all you have is the Helix going to front of house and then coming out of your wedge, you're essentially locked into that place on stage. You really can't move around. If you move out of the firing line of your monitor wedge at all, you completely lose all of your guitar signal. Or if you're running in-ears, all you have is the guitar coming through your in-ears. You don't have anything behind you on stage giving you stage volume, which as a guitar player I think is really important to have, especially when you're playing with a really loud drummer and a bass player who's got an amp on stage. I think you need a cabinet on stage, no matter what type of rig you're running, but especially a modeler like the Helix. Having a cabinet on stage, in my opinion, is really, really important. So for me, that's one issue that the Powercab solved. Having the stage volume from the 112 by itself was enough for me to move around the stage, whether I was on a wedge or on in-ears, and actually feel my amp behind me and not lose my signal completely whenever I moved away from my wedge. Another problem that I think some guitar players run into when using modelers live without a cabinet is that you're missing out on a huge part of the sound of a guitar through a typical tube amp, which is the interaction between the speakers and the guitar, specifically the guitar's pickups. When you're using an amp on stage and you've got a 112 or a 212 or a 412 pushing air, that is interacting with the guitar in real time, and essentially the amp becomes part of the instrument. You get, things like feedback, obviously, but even the way your notes come across and how your tone comes across is interacting with the guitar. The amp and the guitar are interacting in real time. And when you're using a modeler on its own, or you're using a tube amp off stage, it doesn't matter, it's kind of the same thing. You are eliminating that element, that interaction that happens between the guitar and the amp that is really, really musical, especially when it's done well and you have a guitar player that knows how to utilize that connection. It becomes a huge musical part of the guitar's tone. And so for me, I found when I started using the Powercab with the Helix, it brought that interaction back, and I was able to turn around and get feedback from my guitar when I wanted it. And it felt like I was using one of my tube amps. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about the Powercab specifically for this video was I've actually used other monitoring systems for modelers in the past. I've used straight up monitors like floor wedges as a cabinet. I've used some of the other sort of cabinet designed for modelers, and I've also used power amps with regular cabinets. So you have, the modeler and then a power amp and then a regular guitar cabinet. And each one of those kind of has its own drawback. Chief among them, using a wedge or a full range, like an FRFR cab on its own, it's not a guitar cabinet and it's not a guitar speaker. So it doesn't sound like a guitar amp. It doesn't sound like an amp plugged into a cab. It sounds like a modeler being amplified for stage volume. And to me, it just didn't really feel that great. I never really connected with that setup. The other way, which was modeler power amp cabinet, was better, but you got this weird interaction with the solid state power amp between the modeler and the cabinet that didn't really feel right, especially when you were pushing the power amp a little bit harder, pushing the cabinet a little bit harder. It never really felt right. It never responded the way I was used to having a tube amp on a cabinet respond. But I like the Powercab because it is essentially a guitar speaker. It is FRFR, but the construction of the speaker is as you would build any other guitar speaker in any other cabinet. And because of that, it resonates and responds like a real speaker does. So all in all, I'm genuinely a big fan of the Powercab, and I actually prefer the 112 over the 212. The 212 sounds great, and it's cool because you can actually run true stereo out of it. But for me, this thing is small, lightweight. You can throw it in the back of a trailer or back of a car super easily. It fits on just about any stage, and it's unbelievably loud. For a 112 cabinet, it is plenty loud enough to keep up with any drummer I've ever played with on just about any stage. So those are my thoughts on the Powercab 112. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm Rhett Shull, and thank you so much for watching.